52 episodes, 52 ordinary people, 52 real stories about things that affect overall health. Because there is a lot more that goes into being healthy than food and fitness. Inspiration, support, a new perspective, and knowledge. You'll find that and more here on the Healthability Project.
Hi, welcome to the Healthability Project. I'm Robin McKenna. On June 5th, 1981, the U.S. Center for Disease Control publishes an article in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report entitled Pneumocystis Pneumonia, Los Angeles. The article describes cases of a rare lung infection, Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which will later become known as PCP, in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. Los Angeles immunologist Dr. Michael Gottlieb, the CDC's Dr. Wayne Shandera, and their colleagues report that all the men had other unusual infections as well, indicating that their immune systems are not working. By the time the report is published, 2 of the men are dead, and the remaining 3 will die soon after. This article is the first official reporting of what will later become known as the AIDS epidemic. News and reports of unusual immunodeficient cases in gay men begin to escalate, and only a month later, the phrases gay man's pneumonia and gay cancer enter the public lexicon. In August of that year, the first monies, private or public, are raised for Dr. Friedman Kine to support his research on this burgeoning epidemic. These are the only monies raised that year. The amount, $6,635. In December, a pediatric immunologist at the Albert Einstein Medical College in New York, Dr. Ari Rubenstein, treats 5 Black infants who are showing signs of severe immune deficiency, including PCP. At least 3 infants are the children of women who use drugs and engage in sex work. Dr. Rubenstein recognizes that the children are showing signs of the same illnesses affecting gay men, but his diagnoses are dismissed by his colleagues. By the end of 1981, 337 cases of severe immune deficiency are reported in the United States. 16 of them are children under the age of 13. By December 31st, 1981, 130 of these 337 people are dead. The AIDS epidemic is said to have peaked in the mid-2000s, over 20 years after the CDC's initial report. It is estimated that during the peak of the AIDS epidemic, 2 million people around the world were dying annually from AIDS. Here to share his story of the AIDS epidemic is Lee Chu. Lee grew up in the South nearly 75 years ago, but quickly headed north to New York City in the early 70s. Eager to become a professional actor, he worked off-Broadway, toured across the country, and kept busy with commercials, industrial shows, and print work. But in the 1980s, AIDS crashed down hard on the gay community, and Lee himself tested positive in 1987. Over the course of the next 9 years, his immune system deteriorated until he was half paralyzed. He had lost close to 60 pounds and had endured multiple opportunistic infections. Suddenly, in 1996, thanks to a new class of drugs, protease inhibitors, Lee's disease was reversed. Lee went from a wheelchair to a walker to a cane to a bicycle over the course of just a single year. His experience with AIDS inspired Lee to redirect his entire life. He enrolled in social work school and became a psychotherapist. Lee, I'm so glad to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the importance that you are putting on a period of time. I mean, we've just gone through COVID, and fortunately, COVID was not a death sentence for every single person who had it, but wind back to the 1980s and up until 1996, it was pretty much being infected with HIV was pretty much a death sentence.
Mm.
Almost every. I don't know the percentage. I can't say that exactly, but you were smart not to expect to survive it.
Wow. I mean, the whole community must have just been living in fear.
Well, I think it was in general there was a feeling of fear because partly the population of gay men was kind of in hiding, and so you didn't know that necessarily the guy who worked in the office cubicle next to you was gay or not. He
Mm.
might be hiding that. He might be keeping that a secret, and I think I was thinking about this when a very famous movie star who was very masculine and very popular, Rock Hudson, when
Mm-hmm.
he openly admitted that he had AIDS because he had deteriorated to where he really looked sick. It was impossible not to know that he was sick, and I think that there were certain experiences that affected the whole world, but I guess I'm speaking mainly of the United States, that people realized that this was a very frightening disease, and that you couldn't. And of course, it was over time. People began to realize that heterosexuals could contract AIDS and die too. I
Mm.
mean, there were whole families, hemophiliacs who got lots and lots of blood transfusions, were a very high at risk group who died of AIDS, and so it became more and more evident that it was dangerous, very dangerous. Well, I remember in the early '80s, I heard people make jokes. There was a style of decorating that was track lighting and industrial carpet, and that was a lot frequently the interior design of a gay man's apartment. And I remember somebody made a joke that they discovered the cause of AIDS, that it was industrial carpeting and gay and track lighting. You know that there was still room at that time to make jokes about it.
Okay.
But I think even with COVID, I don't think people made jokes about it. But I think the AIDS, and I'm going to use another word, pandemic, the AIDS pandemic, because there was every country on the planet have gay men, and every country on the planet was at risk of having an AIDS epidemic. And so it affected children in Africa. It was a huge thing. And I think I was telling you earlier that I did certain things after I found out I had the virus. I got arrested at the Supreme Court because I was angry about the sodomy laws that were not overturned. And I thought, if I'm ever going to stand up and be handcuffed and taken to a jail cell, now is the time to do it, because I have nothing. You come to a point where you say, I have nothing to lose. If I wanted to go to Europe, if I wanted to spend all the money I had saved up in my mutual fund, now's the time to spend all that money on your bucket list, things that you want to do. And sometimes bucket lists can include protesting,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something to be proud of. So and I did have a bucket list, and I tried to do things that I had postponed, and because I was in my 30s, and I thought that by the time I was 60 or 70, I would want this much money to pay for my bills. Well, I didn't give a flying F for that. I wasn't expecting to be. The fact that I'm sitting here and talking to you and I'm 75, I had no expectation that I would ever achieve that. It
Wow.
was just it was out of the question. But as I slowly began to realize that the disease was not getting worse, that I was not in a wheelchair anymore, I thought to myself, I'm not going to sit here for the whatever remainder of my life and watch cable television because I had enough money to survive, but I thought it's time to go to college. And
Hmm.
so I said, I'm going to be a college co-ed. And I went to NYU. It was very interesting because I thought being a therapist is an incredibly similar experience to being an actor. As an actor, you get a script and you're playing the evil. I'm going to use you as an example. You play the selfish evil woman,
Mhm.
and so that's you have to understand her. You have to even grow to like her and understand why she's evil or whatever. And when you're a therapist, somebody walks into your office and sits down and tells you that they hate their mother, and you've got to figure out why do they hate their mother. You've got to put together the whole components
Mhm.
of psychological components of who that person is. And
Mhm.
so it's a really good profession to begin to work from if you've been an actor.
Mhm. So it seems like you basically had this death sentence, and in a way, you became empowered to have a very unusual bucket list and, demonstrate and be politically active. And was there some inspiration behind A, your own suffering, or B, the suffering of those around you? I mean, you had to have watched many friends die that inspired you to be a therapist because you could relate to suffering?
Well, I mean, everybody can relate to suffering. Some minor sufferings and some major sufferings, but everybody has to know what that feels like. And I didn't want to sit around and feel sorry for myself. In fact, I did some volunteer work. I volunteered to help people who were really sick. And I remember going to a man's apartment and he answered from the bed. And when I knocked on the door, and I went in to see him, and I think I was delivering some food or just maybe bringing some magazines for him to read. And I remember I left his apartment and I thought, okay, I want to do volunteer work. I want to do something that's beneficial to other human beings, but I can't do this.
Really?
It was too much. It was too much. And, one of Freud's defense mechanisms is denial. And there are times when denial is extremely useful and
Mhm.
you just avoid thinking about something. And if you're capable of doing that, it can be very comforting and helpful. And I didn't want to turn my back. I couldn't turn my back on what was happening, but I did seek out medical care. I always tried. There must have been about 10 different antiviral medications that came along before protease inhibitors did. And I said yes to everything
Wow.
because I figured maybe it's only going to give me 2 months or 6 months. And sometimes the medications had side effects that were not helpful, that hurt me. But it was truly, truly heartbreaking to lose. I mean, I lost acquaintances. I lost a lover who died from AIDS, and I lost some of my best friends.
Mm.
And I don't spend too much time thinking about it, but if and I guess thinking about doing this with you, I thought to myself, what would the world have looked like if AIDS had not come along?
Mm.
We still don't know how it came into the world. Just like people aren't sure if COVID came from bats or came from a laboratory. We don't know. I mean, but we can be confident that there will be other epidemics to
Mm.
come along, and I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here, but we live in a scary world and there are opportunities out there for things to come along. And, I could throw in some euphemisms like live every day and love every day. And there were times, Robin, when I realized that I was improving and that I was going to be able to pick a school and pick a career and live it was almost like I had to start my whole life all over again. And there were times that was really I mean, I'm trying to think of the word. I was enthused. I was enthused in a way that I probably would never have been. But now that so many of us are living longer lives, it's very useful to think about who else would you like to be,
Right. The
besides the person.
opportunity to reinvent yourself. And that's
Right.
fairly common these days, but I mean, you had such an unbelievable opportunity to do that. I mean, it really was a gift of life, a second life.
Yeah, and I try to think about how blessed I am, but I still get impatient and annoyed and irritated and all the day to day painful experiences that you say if you're given this gift that life's going to be taken away from you and then you get it back, that you're always going to be so full of joy and that but no, you go back to your usual bitchy self. Uh, but in doing this, and I'm grateful for you giving me an opportunity. But in doing it, I realized I was very lucky to have the kind of inner resilience to just keep going. I think life is so much about survival, and I think it's just I wanted to live as long as I could, and the fact that
Mhm.
I'm now in my mid 70s, I'm astounded, and I'm grateful.
Do you ever experience, or did you, newly after surviving, experience survivor's guilt?
Absolutely, absolutely. You wonder. Well, so many people with so much talent and so much potential, it was pulled out from under their feet. And I sometimes I'll hear about a person in their late 30s or early 40s who have suddenly have a heart attack and die. And you realize that there really are no guarantees in
Mm,
life. And if you happen to be a person who can roll with the punches, I don't know how other than the fact that my mother and father had sex, I have no idea how I came to be on this planet at this time. And I have no, I'm just grateful that I had the stamina to make up another life. And although I wanted to be an actor, and that's why I came to New York, and I loved the work that I got to do. Sometimes it was stupid. I mean, doing a Charmin commercial, or there's no. You might make a lot of money, but it's not gratifying.
mhm.
It's not, other than how gratifying it is to have money. But I got an enormous amount of gratitude and gratification out of being a therapist. I loved it, and I still do. I only see a few patients now.
So you were diagnosed in 1987, and you said that you got back your life in 1996. So what happened over the course of that time? Who took care of you? Like how did your sickness progress? But how did it affect you? Were you like immediately thinking that that's it, I'm gonna not make it? Or some days you felt like you were gonna make it and others days you didn't? Or and who took care of you? Who
Well,
was there for
well,
you?
my sister, Kathy, who's 3 years younger than me, but has an amazing, compassionate personality. She and my mother came to take care of me, and my nephew and my sister's partner. I had a support team. I did. But the interesting thing about the virus is, yes, you've tested positive, and over the course of time, your immune system begins to weaken get a little bit weaker. But I had absolutely no symptoms.
Hmm.
For I would say the first thing that happened to me is started having night sweats, and I would wake up. It's not like you need to turn the air conditioner up.
Mhm.
It's like the bed is soaking wet, and so
Mm,
you have to get up. You have to take a shower. You have to put new sheets on the bed. And I was in rehearsal for a show in Cleveland at that time,
mm.
and then I went to the doctor, and he said, "You have pneumonia." And then he said, "And besides that, you have an intestinal disease.
Mhm.
And so I went, oh my God, I have 3 symptoms. But before that happened, which that happened in 1996, I felt great. I didn't come down with the flu more frequently. I didn't have colds more often. It made me realize that for those people who are out there rolling the dice and thinking, well, that person doesn't look sick. I'm pretty sure I can uh, hook up with them and go home with them tonight and have sex, because you would think you could sort of look around a party or a bar and say, though that person looks too thin, that person looks, but you know what? There was nothing about me
Mm.
that would tip anybody off.
Mm.
Uh, so I was really glad I tested and that I found out, because I might have lived my life complete if I pretended like I was HIV negative, because I just didn't want to know anything other than that. If I'd have been afraid to find out, I might not have done some of those things that I did. I probably wouldn't have protested or gone to see Paris or things that I said I have to do.
What was the community like? Were there many people that were in denial and refused to be tested and were just rolling the dice, or were people being health conscious and wanting to know so that they could prepare or just take care of themselves?
Well, the people started dying, as you said in your introduction, in the early 80s, but people didn't know that it was a virus, and they didn't know if you could get it from sneezing or drinking a glass of water or going to a water fountain, and somebody before you who had the virus would give you the virus. So it was a very frightening community. I mean, the same thing with COVID. I mean, during the beginning days of COVID, how easy can you get it? And unfortunately, COVID, it was a lot easier to get than HIV was. So, it was a terribly bleak and tragic time. And watching people, I live in a building that is predominantly has had a huge population. It's 45 stories. And I remember the doors to the elevator opening, and there'd be a guy standing in the elevator, and I would look at him and go, he looks awfully thin.
Mm.
He he looks very thin. And then, but I wouldn't know him, let's say, but I knew he lived in the building and I recognized him. And then fast forward to 6 months later, not 6 months, 6 weeks, or yeah, about 6 weeks later, the door to the elevator opens and he's lost another 20 pounds and he looks really bad. And that was the kind of atmosphere that
Yeah.
you lived in. And and I being in the theater, there were an inordinately large number of gay men in the entertainment industry, and I mean, there were a lot of deaths. Michael Bennett, who created A Chorus Line, he died of AIDS. And what are the shows that he didn't have a chance to create that would have had the same impact as A Chorus Line, let's say?
Mhm.
And Rock Hudson was, I mean, he was probably in his 50s. He wasn't a young man, but he would have been continued to work.
Right.
You know, I started to say Elton John, but he didn't die of AIDS. Although he did a lot to raise awareness and create the Elton John Foundation and things like that. I mean, and I was a member of ACT UP, which some people have heard of them, and also GMHC, the Gay Men's Health Crisis. Those were organizations, and I think the GMHC kind of started in somebody's apartment, living room, because they looked around and said, it doesn't look like the federal government really wants to look at this as an epidemic and raise money. And this is kind of an ironic thing, Robin, but a lot of gay people were unpopular, hiding from other people and living lives, sequestered lives within a gay community. And when AIDS came along, it put it out there. And suddenly straight people went, I think I do know somebody who's gay. I think my cousin never talks about his girlfriend, but I think he might be gay. And I think a lot of people came out under the circumstances, came out from the threat of this terrible disease. So it actually pushed gay visibility forward.
Okay. And was there, it's kind of a strange thing to say, but was there some level of relief in being pushed out into the open like that within the gay community that, okay, now we're on the radar? And then the mixed emotion with the federal government's not going to help. And, we all know how that story went. So, it just must have been this amazing cocktail of joy, sadness, despair, fear, hope.
Well, hope was probably pretty low on the list of things that was going on. There was a lot of anger. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, had certain medications that they thought would be possible cures or treatments, but they wanted to test them for like 5 years or 6 years. And at one point, the group ACT UP went to the NIH and had a huge sit-in, and they caused a big ruckus because they said, we are fucking dying here. Okay, we're dying. So we would rather try the drug, find out it didn't help us, than wait 10 years when we're not going to be here in 10 years. So that I think that it, in some ways it may have pushed drug development forward, because if you have a disease that is so life-threatening that you're not going to the data indicates you're not going to survive it, then allow people to test drugs sooner. And that has changed, I think, and that will change for the better. And so it's funny, in every curse there is the seed of a blessing, but it's a hard won blessing, and some people didn't win it. So
did your experience of AIDS and this incredible level of the unknown and the fear and the anxiety, did that help you get through COVID? Because, there was such a high level of fear and anxiety because, again, the public didn't know, like you said earlier, how easy is it to catch and how deadly is it? And I'm just wondering if, people who survived AIDS may have, of course, still been highly, highly concerned, but kind of felt like, I've been through this before.
Well, COVID was, like I said, was easier to acquire than unprotected sex or IV drug use, or if there were clearly certain things that had to happen, and I think a lot that I knew a lot of people who stopped having sex just gave it up until.
Wow.
Until which that's not anything anybody chooses to do in their 30s or 40s, or even ever. But yes, when COVID came along, I was eager to see how easily can you catch it, and now that they talk about different strains, we realize some strains may be easier to acquire than others. But I got vaccinated right away. I was a big fan of anything you could possibly do.
Well, what a remarkable, remarkable experience. Thank you so much for the conversation. Insightful in so many perspectives. I was very young, a teenager when all this was happening, and certainly wasn't really paying attention and didn't realize the gravity of the situation. So to get firsthand reporting on it, especially in New York City. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Lee. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad you weren't sexually active in the 1980s to the point that you would have to be scared. Or maybe you were. I haven't done the math to figure out how old you have been in 1981. But
Too young.
Yeah, pretty young. But you know, and it's funny because I live in a neighborhood in New York that has a high population of gay men, and many of them are a lot younger than me, and they're holding hands and they're married and they've adopted children and done all sorts of things that I never considered options in my life at their ages. And a lot of them don't know much about AIDS. And in
Really?
fact, their ideas about AIDS are they do something called PrEP. And if you're sexually active, I mean, there are AIDS drugs that seem to be working wonders. Unfortunately, there is not a cure any more than there's a cure for COVID. These are scary things to get. Any of them are. But the medical miracle of protease inhibitors absolutely changed my life. And you know, as far as there was the first protease inhibitor I took was something called Crixivan, and I always used to tell people that to me I worshipped Crixivan. That was my god, because without Crixivan I would have been dead. And
Wow.
so it was as simple as that.
Wow.
And it took a long time before I trusted that I was going to keep living.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, anyway, thank you for asking such insightful questions and showing such compassion. It means a lot to me too.
Thank you, Lee. All right, listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can reach me at thehealthabilityproject@gmail.com. Tune in next week. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thanks for joining us today at the Healthability Project. We'd love to hear from you, so please email us your questions, comments, or suggestions, including future guests, to thehealthabilityproject@gmail.com. And please like us, subscribe, and share us with your friends.